Hey friends, Jim McKnight here. I wanted to share a little tip from the No Place Left Army Network. We call this the 6-hour guideline. If we're going to see fruitful church planting movements across the nation and the nations, the movements will always be birthed on the back of people with jobs, people who are already busy. And so if we're going to see that happen, we're going to have to give them both efficient and effective ways to make disciples, to lead others to Christ, and to multiply churches. And so we use this little 6-hour guideline to help people diagnose if they're spending their time wisely and if they're doing the right things with their time. And so if you're a busy person and you want to see God use your life to multiply disciples and churches and grow his kingdom, here's some tips for you. The first 2 hours that we want you to spend in your week is 2 hours where you're in a church being trained. And if you're in one of our churches or if you're in a church that's outwardly focused, pretty quickly you're going to learn to share your testimony and the gospel. And we want you to then begin spending time, 2 more hours, doing evangelism. Now, initially, we would expect that all that evangelism will be focused through your family and your friends and through what we call your relational network or your oikos. And that shouldn't cost you any additional time because it's natural. It's as you're going to work. But a lot of people do go through everybody that they know pretty quickly sharing the gospel, and they still haven't found anybody that's willing to be trained to share the gospel and to help with God's mission. And so then we ask them to do 2 hours of intentional evangelism, doing a house of peace search or going to public places like a market or a mall or something like that where they can share with a high volume of people fairly quickly. And as soon as they find somebody that wants to be trained, that receives the gospel and is willing to invite us into their relational network, we want you to stop spending that 2 hours on evangelism and start spending 2 hours where you're doing training for other people in your church. Now notice this arrow here is two-headed because we want you going out every week and then we want you coming back every week to get more training. So when we send you out to go start a church, it's not because you are trained, it's because you're in training. And we don't want people to be confused thinking that we have blessed them as if they don't need any more development or training. If you do that, you'll never get a sustained movement of the gospel. But as soon as you begin your church, you're going to want to begin training others right away to share their testimony and the gospel. And as that happens, your friends should go out that you train and do evangelism and start their church. Now notice you've got more people now sharing the gospel and starting more churches, and it hasn't cost you any more time. In fact, you have multiplied yourself at this point as you train others. And this is how the gospel can take off without any more time out of your life. As that continues to happen pretty soon, you're going to find out that there's some nuanced things, some nuanced questions that you have to ask that aren't necessarily covered by the standard curriculum that we're using, and that you're going to need some more leader development. So we're going to ask for another hour of your time to meet with the person leading the church where you're getting trained for intentional discipleship in an accountability team. And that should take about an hour. And that can happen over lunch or breakfast or something simple or coffee. And at the same time, if we're going to see sustained movements of the gospel, you're going to have to be doing leader development with your people. And that's going to cost another hour of your time where you're in an accountability team with your best leader from your church. Now you say, okay, that's great. That's 3 churches up there on the screen, but how's that really going to get us to a movement? Well, remember, you're not the only person in your church being trained. That whole church in that first generation is also being trained. And so if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, pretty soon you're going to start to see networks that look like this. And this is how you get a sustained, connected movement of the gospel. A few tips that I want to share with you just to kind of review how this goes down. How you spend your 6 hours. So you're 2 hours in a church where you're getting trained, 2 hours where you're training others, an hour where you're receiving mentorship in an accountability team, and an hour where you're mentoring others in depth. That should help you spend your time wisely. Here's a couple of mistakes that people make along the way that'll keep them from getting fruitful. Common pitfalls. The first is they're in a church, they're spending 2 hours a week in a church, but they're not really getting trained. They're learning theological teaching. They are doing a lot of singing, and they're building good relationships and good friendships, but they're not being equipped to take the gospel to their lost friends. And so that will stop the whole thing in its tracks if you're not being equipped yourself in the beginning. And often some people are doing more than 2 hours a week of kind of being fed. They can spend Wednesday night, Sunday morning, spending a lot of time where they're being fed but nothing equipped to go out. That'll stop a movement in its tracks pretty quickly, or it won't even get off the ground. Another thing that's happened is they're getting trained, but they're not really willing to share with their entire oikos and just share the gospel indiscriminately to see where the people are that God's already working. They kind of pre-select the people that they want to share with, and they'll kind of keep it to that. That'll also stop a movement in its tracks. They'll also, not sharing outside of your oikos is another mistake that people will make. So they'll share with everybody that they know, they feel comfortable with their friends, but they're not willing to generate new relationships around the gospel and introduce themselves by saying, I'm someone that follows Jesus as my Lord. Another mistake is that people continue to share instead of training the person of peace, or that person that welcomes them into their life. And so some people are really great at evangelism, and they'll lead someone to Christ, and they'll find someone that's eager for training, and they'll just move on instead of following Jesus' instructions in Matthew 10:11, where they should stay at that person's house. Another mistake is that when you do start the church with that person of peace, that next church, but you don't intentionally train your friends. I call this defaulting back to churchianity, where you spend a lot of time talking about the Bible, you spend a lot of time building relationships and singing, but there's not a lot of time where you're intentionally equipping others and holding each other accountable to spending time with God and His Word, and equipping others and getting out and sharing the gospel yourselves. And that's not part of the DNA of that new church. That will allow your church to survive. It'll continue, but it will never multiply. Another mistake is people get this sense that they've arrived and they've kind of got it all figured out once they get a church started, and they don't come back to their mentor to keep asking questions. And so they fail to ask for leader development. And finally, another mistake is that people don't select individuals within their church who are most qualified for future leadership and spend additional time with them, developing them and making sure that this gospel movement will continue long beyond the initial church that got started. So those are some tips on the 6-hour guideline on how to spend your time wisely. I hope this helps you and your friends in your ministry. And stay tuned. We'll post some more videos